Today, I would like to talk about one of the most tragic and shocking events in South America's history, the Goiânia Accident. This incident, which occurred in 1987 in Brazil, was not only a major catastrophe for the people involved, but also a crucial moment in the history of nuclear safety worldwide. It began when a radioactive material, cesium-137, was illegally removed from a defunct medical facility and found its way into the hands of untrained individuals. What followed was a series of errors, misunderstandings, and sheer human curiosity, which would ultimately lead to irreversible consequences. The story of the Goiânia accident is one of both ignorance and negligence. It's a stark reminder of the dangers posed by radioactive materials and the critical importance of proper handling and security. But it's also a testament to human resilience and the response of the authorities, who worked tirelessly to contain the damage and prevent further loss of life. The radioactive material, when handled improperly, exposed many people to harmful radiation. The immediate and long-term effects were devastating. Several people lost their lives, and many others suffered from radiation sickness. It wasn't just those who directly came into contact with the material who were affected, but also their families, their communities, and the entire city of Goiânia. The physical, emotional, and environmental toll would be felt for years to come. Authorities, including the Brazilian government and international organizations like the World Health Organization, were quick to respond, and over time, the area was cleaned up and decontaminated. However, the Goiânia accident left a lasting scar on the community and on the nation's collective memory. This tragic event underscores the importance of strong regulatory frameworks and heightened awareness around the handling of nuclear and radioactive materials. It is essential that we learn from the mistakes of the past to prevent similar accidents from happening again in the future. As we reflect on the Goiânia accident, we must continue to advocate for the safety of all people, educate the public on the dangers of radiation, and ensure that we never lose sight of the need for vigilance in nuclear safety. In doing so, we honor the memory of those affected and ensure that their suffering was not in vain. The Goiânia accident, which unfolded in the heart of Brazil's state of Goiás in 1987, stands as one of the most significant nuclear disasters in South American history. It began when a piece of medical equipment containing a highly radioactive material known as cesium-137 was abandoned at a former clinic. This clinic had been left unused and unguarded, which was the starting point for a tragic series of events. The device containing the radioactive material was not secured properly, and the contents were not adequately monitored or disposed of, leaving it vulnerable to being accessed by anyone who found it. In this particular case, two individuals, unaware of the extreme dangers of what they had found, managed to salvage the abandoned equipment. At first, they thought little of its unusual nature, dismissing it as some sort of strange object with a glowing blue light. They quickly brought it to their home, where they began to disassemble it, attempting to salvage whatever value they could from the seemingly strange find. What they didn't know was that the object they had uncovered contained a source of radiation, cesium-137, a byproduct of nuclear fission that can be deadly if mishandled. This lack of awareness and understanding of the potential dangers set off a chain reaction. The radioactive material was not locked away, nor was it immediately identified as a serious hazard. As the two men began to share the glowing substance with others, they unknowingly spread contamination. This careless distribution of cesium-137 led to a tragic and irreversible sequence of events. The material was eventually passed on to other individuals who came into contact with it and even took pieces of the radioactive substance home, exposing entire families, as well as neighbors, to the devastating effects of radiation. In total, the disaster impacted many lives, and the consequences would extend well beyond just those who physically handled the material. This accident highlighted the profound dangers posed by the illegal handling of radioactive materials, especially in a context where individuals lacked the necessary knowledge or protective measures. It also underscored the glaring inadequacy of safety protocols in the storage, handling, and disposal of nuclear waste and radioactive substances, which should have been strictly regulated and controlled by authorities. The Goiania accident was a wake-up call for the international community about the dire consequences that can arise when radioactive materials are not properly contained and monitored. The Goiania accident brought into sharp focus the critical dangers of improper disposal and the complete lack of adequate security when it comes to radioactive materials. Cesium-137, the radioactive substance involved in this disaster, is an isotope that, when mishandled, can cause severe and long-lasting harm to human health and the environment. However, despite the potentially catastrophic risks associated with such materials, the clinic that had previously housed the radioactive equipment failed to dispose of the material in a safe or secure manner. The equipment containing the cesium-137 was left unattended and unsecured for an extended period, making it vulnerable to unauthorized access and ultimately leading to its illegal removal. This oversight revealed a larger issue. There were no clear protocols in place to ensure the safe storage and disposal of radioactive waste. In an age where nuclear technology was becoming more widely used, the proper handling of radioactive substances was critical for preventing accidents. Yet, the clinic, where the device was once in use, had failed to secure the radioactive material after it was no longer needed. This lapse in protocol meant that anyone, including individuals with no expertise in handling dangerous materials, could access the hazardous substance. The lack of clear regulations surrounding the disposal of radioactive items compounded the situation, as the clinic had not followed proper decommissioning processes that would have included taking the equipment to an authorized disposal facility. Moreover, once the material was removed and found its way into the hands of unqualified individuals, there was no public awareness about the dangers of radiation exposure. At the time, very few people were informed about how radioactive materials could be harmful even if handled improperly, which further exacerbated the consequences of this oversight. In the case of the Goiania accident, the public's ignorance about the dangers of radioactive materials made the situation even worse. People unwittingly exposed themselves and others to radiation, not understanding the deadly nature of the substance they were handling. The absence of security measures was not limited to the abandoned clinic. The lack of a system for tracking or securing radioactive materials in the country overall contributed to the widespread contamination that followed. It became clear that there were no strong barriers in place to prevent unauthorized access, whether due to ignorance or malice. This was a significant failure in not just the immediate handling of the material, but also in the overall management of nuclear substances in Brazil at the time. The incident raised critical questions about how society and governments handle the dangers of radioactive materials, including how to ensure that proper safety measures are always in place to prevent such materials from being improperly disposed of or exposed. The Goiania accident ultimately exposed significant flaws in the regulatory framework surrounding radioactive materials, pointing to a desperate need for stronger laws, better safety protocols, and a heightened public awareness to prevent a tragedy of this magnitude from happening again. The immediate aftermath of the Goiania accident was nothing short of devastating. As cesium-137, a highly radioactive substance, spread through the community, the effects on human health were swift and catastrophic. The individuals who initially came into contact with the material were exposed to intense levels of radiation, and many of them began to experience the severe consequences of radiation sickness, which includes nausea, vomiting, fatigue, and hair loss, among other symptoms. Radiation sickness is caused by the damage that radiation does to the body's cells, particularly to the bone marrow and the gastrointestinal system, which can be fatal if the exposure is severe enough. The first victims of the accident, including the two men who discovered the radioactive material, quickly began to show signs of acute radiation sickness. However, they did not initially understand what was happening to them. Despite feeling ill, the lack of immediate medical knowledge about the radiation they had been exposed to meant that they did not seek proper medical help in time. Unfortunately, this delay in recognizing the nature of their illness further worsened their conditions. Eventually, some of them would succumb to the effects of radiation, losing their lives as a result of the exposure. But the tragic consequences didn't stop with the initial victims. As the radioactive material circulated in the community, it came into contact with dozens of others who had no idea of the danger they were facing. People carried pieces of the glowing substance into their homes, passed it around among friends and family, and even sold it, unaware that they were exposing themselves and those around them to deadly radiation. Children, too, were affected, as they were often the most curious and prone to handling strange objects. In many cases, entire families were contaminated, with multiple members experiencing the horrific side effects of radiation sickness. The visible effects on the people involved were chilling. Their skin began to show severe burns and lesions from the radiation exposure. The individuals who had come into direct contact with the radioactive substance faced the worst consequences, but even those who were only indirectly exposed suffered long-term health problems. In total, around 249 people were contaminated with radiation, and 4 people died as a direct result of their exposure. The individuals who survived the acute radiation sickness had to endure extensive medical treatment and long-term monitoring to manage the health impacts that would last for years. Beyond the physical suffering, the psychological and emotional toll was immense. The survivors and the families of those who died had to live with the trauma of the experience. Many felt guilt and disbelief at how easily their lives had been disrupted by a simple mistake, while others faced the stigma and fear associated with radiation exposure. For some, the psychological scars were as damaging as the physical ones. The incident also triggered fear and anxiety among the local population of Goiânia, as many people were unsure if they, too, had been contaminated or if they were at risk of future health complications from the exposure. The devastating health effects were further compounded by the confusion and lack of immediate medical understanding of radiation exposure in the area. Healthcare professionals initially struggled to identify the cause of the symptoms and had little experience dealing with radiation sickness. It wasn't until authorities were alerted and radiation experts arrived that the full extent of the disaster was understood. By then, it was too late for some victims, and many others had already suffered significant harm. The medical community faced an overwhelming challenge in trying to manage the crisis and treat the victims of the disaster, with limited resources and knowledge on how best to address the situation. In summary, the immediate effects of the Goiânia accident were tragic on multiple levels. The loss of life, the suffering from radiation sickness, and the long-term health consequences left deep scars on the individuals and the community involved. This tragic chapter in Brazil's history serves as a grim reminder of the devastating consequences of mishandling radioactive materials and the urgent need for proper safety protocols in dealing with such dangerous substances. The Goiânia accident, with its catastrophic consequences, went far beyond the immediate health effects on the individuals who had come into contact with the radioactive cesium-137. The contamination spread widely throughout the city, reaching not just the immediate vicinity of the individuals who had directly handled the material, but also infecting entire neighborhoods and local communities. This widespread contamination turned Goiânia into a virtual hot zone of radiation, creating a lasting environmental and public health crisis. As the radioactive material was mishandled and transported throughout the city, it left a trail of contamination. The individuals who had touched the material carried traces of it wherever they went, unknowingly spreading it to homes, schools, and public places. The contamination affected not only the areas where people had direct physical contact with the radioactive substance, but also extended to spaces where they had lingered or left behind traces of the dangerous material. Homes were some of the worst hit areas, as families unknowingly brought radioactive dust and particles into their homes. Items that had come into contact with the radioactive material, such as clothing, furniture, and even toys, became radioactive. Children, who are particularly vulnerable to the harmful effects of radiation, were exposed to the greatest risks. In some instances, pieces of the glowing substance were kept in people's homes as curiosities, further contaminating their surroundings. The radiation was not immediately detectable by the naked eye, and so people went about their daily lives, unaware that they were living in an environment laden with deadly radiation. The contamination spread further as individuals who had been affected by radiation traveled throughout the city, unknowingly carrying traces of cesium-137 with them. Public spaces such as schools, markets, and even hospital waiting rooms were inadvertently exposed to radioactive material. Over time, it became clear that the entire city was dealing with the fallout from this accident. The scope of the contamination was so severe that authorities had no choice but to declare large portions of Goiânia as unsafe and uninhabitable until they could be properly cleaned up and decontaminated. In addition to the contamination of homes and public spaces, environmental damage from the radioactive release was also extensive. Soil, vegetation, and water sources in the affected areas were contaminated with cesium-137, posing long-term threats to the ecosystem. The material can linger in the environment for many years, gradually decaying and releasing harmful radiation during its half-life. This meant that not only did the residents of Goiânia face immediate health risks, but future generations would also potentially suffer from the long-term environmental consequences of the disaster. The cleanup effort that followed the accident was monumental. Local and federal authorities, along with international experts, were called in to decontaminate the city and remove any radioactive material from the environment. The process involved carefully scrubbing surfaces, removing contaminated soil, and decontaminating homes, public buildings, and vehicles. In some cases, entire homes were demolished because they had been so heavily contaminated that cleaning them was impossible. The scale of the cleanup effort reflected the magnitude of the contamination and the deep concern over the long-term environmental and health effects that could result from the radiation. The environmental damage was not confined to the immediate area of Goiânia. As the radioactive material had been transported over a wide area, it created a significant environmental problem that required years of effort to address. Wildlife in the affected areas, including plants, animals, and insects, was exposed to the radiation, potentially affecting the local food chain and biodiversity. Although the exact extent of the environmental harm to local ecosystems is difficult to measure, it is certain that the fallout from the Goiânia accident had a lasting impact on the region's environment. The spread of cesium-137 into the natural environment not only posed a direct threat to public health, but also disrupted the delicate balance of local ecosystems, with potential consequences for years or even decades to come. In conclusion, the widespread contamination of Goiânia and the surrounding areas was one of the most alarming and tragic aspects of the accident. It demonstrated the far-reaching effects of mishandling radioactive material and the extreme dangers posed by contamination of public spaces and the environment. The environmental harm that resulted from the Goiânia accident is still felt today, serving as a chilling reminder of the enduring consequences of inadequate safety measures when dealing with nuclear materials. The Goiânia accident underscored the devastating consequences of ignorance and negligence on multiple levels, not just among the individuals who mishandled the radioactive material, but also within the broader context of institutional oversight and regulatory failure. The initial mishandling of cesium-137 was a result of a lack of understanding of the risks associated with radioactive materials, both by the individuals involved and by the authorities responsible for safeguarding public safety. This widespread ignorance led to a catastrophic sequence of events that could have been avoided with proper awareness, education, and security measures. First, the people who came into contact with the radioactive material were entirely unaware of its dangerous nature. The two individuals who first discovered the abandoned medical equipment in the clinic had no knowledge of radiation or its potential to cause harm. To them, the glowing blue substance seemed like a curiosity, something potentially valuable or interesting. They did not understand that the substance they were handling could expose them to life-threatening radiation. This lack of knowledge was compounded by the fact that they were unable to identify the material as something hazardous, which led them to disassemble the device and spread the radioactive substance around, both among themselves and to others. Their ignorance of the material's dangers was not an isolated case. Many others in the community, including children and adults, came into contact with the cesium-137 without any understanding of its lethal nature. The tragedy also highlighted the systemic failure of the authorities to enforce safety protocols that would have prevented such an incident from occurring in the first place. At the time of the Goiânia accident, there were inadequate safety regulations and a lack of enforcement when it came to the handling, storage, and disposal of radioactive materials. The medical facility that had originally used the cesium-137 equipment had no proper decommissioning procedure in place. When the equipment was no longer in use, it was simply abandoned without ensuring that the radioactive material was either properly contained or safely disposed of. No mechanisms were in place to track the equipment or ensure its secure disposal, which allowed the radioactive material to fall into the hands of those who had no idea how to deal with it safely. This failure to implement proper safety procedures was not just the responsibility of the clinic, but was also reflective of a broader gap in the country's regulatory framework for handling dangerous materials. The Brazilian government and regulatory bodies had not developed, or had not enforced, sufficient protocols for dealing with radioactive materials, especially those in disuse. The lack of training and oversight meant that people working with or in proximity to radioactive substances were not equipped with the knowledge necessary to handle them safely, nor were there mechanisms in place to ensure that the equipment and waste were properly managed. Additionally, the lack of public education about the dangers of radiation played a crucial role in exacerbating the disaster. At the time, few people understood what radiation exposure could do to the human body or how it could affect the environment. This general lack of awareness contributed to the spreading of contaminated material throughout Goiânia, as people, including children, handled the material without realizing the risks they were taking. Even when victims began to fall ill from radiation sickness, the medical community in Brazil was not prepared to recognize the signs immediately. Healthcare providers initially struggled to understand the symptoms and causes of the radiation sickness, delaying the treatment of affected individuals and allowing the situation to worsen. The tragedy also highlighted how negligence could compound the effects of a disaster. Not only did the authorities fail to intervene when the radioactive material was first mishandled, but once the scale of the contamination became apparent, the response was not swift enough to prevent further exposure. It wasn't until several days later that the Brazilian government, in conjunction with international radiation experts, began to address the issue. In the interim, more people became contaminated, and the public continued to suffer the consequences of delayed action. Moreover, after the event, the way in which the government responded in terms of cleanup and recovery was a reflection of the lack of preparedness for such a disaster. The large-scale decontamination efforts required to address the fallout were both time-consuming and resource-intensive, illustrating how poorly the country was equipped to deal with the aftermath of such an event. The authorities, while ultimately working to decontaminate the affected areas, had not anticipated the magnitude of a disaster involving radioactive material, highlighting the gaps in both their preparedness and response plans. In the aftermath, it became painfully clear that there was a systemic failure to enforce the necessary safeguards against the misuse of hazardous materials. The Goiânia accident exposed the risks that arise from ignorance, the negligence of individuals and institutions, and the failure to maintain rigorous oversight over dangerous substances. This combination of factors led to a situation in which a simple error, compounded by systemic flaws, turned into one of the most tragic nuclear accidents in history. The disaster not only caused significant harm to the victims, but also sent a shockwave through the entire nation, forcing governments and organizations to reevaluate their approach to nuclear safety and regulation. Ultimately, the Goiânia accident was a tragic reminder of the consequences that can occur when safety protocols are ignored, when individuals and institutions fail to act with caution and awareness, and when proper regulatory frameworks are not in place. It demonstrated that the risks of handling radioactive materials are not to be underestimated, and that any failure in safety measures can result in dire and far-reaching consequences. Despite the initial failures and oversights that led to the Goiânia accident, the response from Brazilian authorities and international organizations, once the disaster became clear, was swift and critical in containing the crisis and preventing further loss of life. The rapid mobilization of both local and national resources to address the immediate and long-term consequences of the radioactive contamination played a pivotal role in mitigating the worst effects of the disaster and initiating the extensive cleanup process required to restore public safety. As soon as the scale of the contamination was realized, the Brazilian government took immediate steps to contain the spread of radiation. The federal and local authorities worked together to cordon off affected areas and prevent the further movement of contaminated individuals and materials. Police forces, alongside health and environmental officials, began securing contaminated locations to limit exposure and prevent the spread of radioactive particles. Roadblocks were set up to prevent people from entering highly contaminated zones, and evacuation efforts were initiated to remove individuals from the most severely affected areas, including the homes and neighborhoods that had been directly exposed to cesium-137. The rapid identification of affected locations was key to containing the crisis. Affected houses, public spaces, and even vehicles were carefully isolated to prevent further contamination, and the authorities began the delicate task of assessing the extent of the radiation exposure in various parts of the city. Public health officials were also brought in to start conducting radiation monitoring of different regions, as the extent of the contamination in Goiânia was far broader than originally anticipated. Environmental scientists and radiation experts helped to map out areas of high contamination, and the first steps to prevent further spread of the radioactive material involved a thorough analysis of the geography of exposure, ensuring that key locations could be prioritized for decontamination efforts. International organizations, including the World Health Organization, WHO, and the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, were quick to provide support and expertise as the disaster unfolded. These organizations helped to coordinate the overall response, providing both technical advice and on-the-ground support to help contain the radiation spread. Specialists from the IAEA assisted in the implementation of radiation monitoring, contamination assessment, and the establishment of safety procedures to protect first responders, workers, and the affected population. The involvement of these international experts was invaluable in ensuring that the cleanup process was done in compliance with global standards for radiation safety and public health. In addition to containment efforts, a critical component of the response was the coordination of medical care for those affected by radiation exposure. Hospitals in the region were quickly overwhelmed by the sudden influx of patients suffering from radiation sickness. Given the lack of expertise in dealing with such cases, Brazilian medical personnel were trained and supported by experts from around the world, including those from the IAEA, who provided guidance on how to treat radiation exposure. Medical teams worked tirelessly to manage symptoms of radiation sickness, and efforts were made to provide ongoing care for the victims to prevent further complications. Long-term medical monitoring for those exposed was also initiated, and treatment for radiation burns, as well as psychological counseling for survivors, became an essential part of the response effort. The cleanup process itself was a massive and complex undertaking. Given the highly toxic nature of cesium-137, decontamination was not simply a matter of cleaning surfaces. It involved removing and safely disposing of contaminated materials and, in some cases, demolishing entire buildings. Teams of specialists were deployed to scrub down homes, public spaces, and even entire streets, removing contaminated debris and materials such as furniture, clothing, and soil. In some cases, contaminated areas had to be sealed off entirely, with parts of the city rendered uninhabitable for extended periods. One of the most notable aspects of the cleanup was the removal of large amounts of radioactive soil from residential areas. The soil was carefully excavated, stored, and transported to secure disposal sites to prevent further environmental contamination. At the same time, measures were put in place to inform the public about the dangers of exposure and the precautions they should take. Public health campaigns were launched to educate people on the importance of avoiding contaminated areas, washing contaminated clothing, and seeking immediate medical help if they believed they had been exposed to radiation. Emergency hotlines and community centers were established to provide assistance to affected individuals, helping them access medical care and offering guidance on what to do if they suspected exposure. These public information efforts were essential in maintaining order during the crisis and ensuring that the public did not panic. The international community's involvement in the cleanup effort also helped to ensure that best practices were followed, particularly in terms of environmental safety. Experts advised the Brazilian authorities on how to deal with the long-term effects of radioactive contamination and how to monitor the recovery of the affected areas. In some cases, contaminated areas remained off-limits to residents for years, and the authorities continued to monitor radiation levels even after the initial cleanup was completed. In the aftermath, The experience gained from this swift and coordinated response played a significant role in shaping future nuclear safety protocols worldwide. It highlighted the importance of rapid response mechanisms and the need for global collaboration when managing nuclear accidents, as well as the necessity of well-prepared, adequately trained personnel to respond to such emergencies. In sum, the quick and coordinated response from both Brazilian authorities and international organizations in the wake of the Goiânia accident was essential in containing the crisis and mitigating its impact. The collaborative efforts of national and international teams ensured that the affected areas were decontaminated, the public was informed, and those impacted by radiation exposure received medical attention. Though the disaster caused immense suffering, the timely response prevented further loss of life and set a global precedent for future nuclear safety and disaster management practices. The Goiânia accident had far-reaching consequences, not only for those directly affected but also for the field of nuclear safety worldwide. The disaster revealed deep gaps in the handling, storage, and regulation of radioactive materials, sparking an urgent reevaluation of nuclear safety practices both in Brazil and around the globe. In the wake of this catastrophe, both national and international organizations took swift and deliberate actions to strengthen nuclear safety regulations, ensuring that such a tragedy would not be repeated. The tragedy of Goiânia ultimately served as a catalyst for significant reform in nuclear safety standards, influencing everything from local government policies to international treaties on the safe use and disposal of radioactive substances. One of the immediate effects of the Goiânia accident was the realization that Brazil's existing laws and regulations on radioactive materials were woefully inadequate. Prior to the incident, Brazil did have some regulations in place to govern the use of nuclear materials, but these were either poorly enforced or outdated, leaving significant room for negligence and oversight. The government's failure to properly handle and dispose of the radioactive material from the abandoned medical equipment had shown how vulnerable the country was to such accidents, particularly in the absence of stringent safety procedures. As a result, Brazilian authorities moved quickly to overhaul the country's nuclear safety framework. The Brazilian Nuclear Energy Commission, CNEN, which had previously been responsible for overseeing nuclear safety in the country, became a focal point for reform. In response to the Goiânia disaster, CNEN introduced stricter protocols for the licensing, monitoring, and disposal of radioactive materials. New regulations were put in place to ensure that medical facilities, research institutions, and industrial sites handling radioactive substances would be held to much higher safety standards. These regulations included rigorous guidelines for the proper decommissioning of equipment containing radioactive materials, as well as the establishment of secure disposal methods to prevent any material from being abandoned or mishandled. Moreover, Brazil expanded its commitment to transparency and accountability in its nuclear policies, mandating regular safety audits and inspections of institutions that handled radioactive substances. This was a direct response to the fact that, prior to the Goiânia accident, medical and industrial facilities that used nuclear materials were often not subject to thorough or frequent checks. Under the new regulatory framework, these establishments would be required to demonstrate compliance with safety protocols and to keep detailed records of their radioactive materials, making it easier for authorities to track potential sources of contamination. On an international scale, the Goiânia accident highlighted the need for a more unified and comprehensive approach to nuclear safety, especially in countries with emerging nuclear industries or those lacking the resources for robust oversight. The incident raised alarm among international bodies like the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, which had long been working on improving nuclear safety standards globally, but now had an even stronger incentive to strengthen its protocols and recommendations. In the aftermath of the Goiânia disaster, the IAEA began to push for more uniform international standards on the handling, transport, and disposal of radioactive materials. This included calling for more rigorous licensing procedures for nuclear facilities and demanding greater international cooperation in the event of nuclear accidents, particularly in regions with less advanced safety infrastructure. Internationally, the Goiânia incident also served as a wake-up call for the importance of public awareness and education about the dangers of radioactive materials. Before the tragedy, there had been little attention given to educating the general public about the risks posed by radiation, and this lack of knowledge contributed to the widespread contamination. In the wake of the accident, public outreach efforts were greatly expanded, and organizations such as the IAEA began to place a greater emphasis on educating both the general public and professionals working in industries that involved radioactive substances. Through public campaigns, the goal was to raise awareness about the potential hazards of radiation and to encourage vigilance in ensuring that materials were handled with care. The Goiânia Accident also influenced the development of international treaties and conventions regarding nuclear safety and emergency response. The disaster prompted an increased focus on the need for international treaties that would govern the safe transport and disposal of radioactive waste. These treaties would establish a framework for cooperation among nations in preventing and responding to nuclear accidents and in ensuring that countries were held accountable for their nuclear safety practices. The accident illustrated that the movement of radioactive materials across borders, even if it was unintentional or due to negligence, could have grave consequences not just within a nation's borders, but also for the global community. This realization led to an increased emphasis on cross-border coordination and the need for global standards for nuclear safety. Domestically, the experience of Goiânia led to the creation of a national registry for radioactive materials in Brazil. This registry allowed the government to track and monitor the locations and quantities of radioactive substances being used or stored throughout the country. The aim was to prevent similar accidents from occurring in the future by ensuring that all radioactive materials were securely accounted for and that they were either safely disposed of when no longer needed or carefully monitored if still in use. This system also made it easier to pinpoint potential sources of contamination and rapidly respond to any incidents before they escalated. Furthermore, the Goiânia accident led to the establishment of improved disaster response protocols specific to nuclear and radiological accidents. Brazil, in partnership with international agencies, began to develop more effective strategies for responding to such emergencies. These strategies focused not only on immediate containment and medical care, but also on the long-term monitoring and decontamination of affected areas. The lessons learned from the Goiânia crisis led to the development of specialized emergency response teams trained to handle nuclear accidents and radiation exposure, a practice that would become crucial in the event of future disasters. In conclusion, the Goiânia nuclear accident was a pivotal moment in the history of nuclear safety. While it was a tragic and devastating event, it led to the implementation of far-reaching reforms in nuclear safety regulations, both within Brazil and globally. The changes that followed, ranging from stricter regulatory measures to international cooperation on nuclear safety, helped to strengthen the global nuclear safety framework and ensure that similar accidents would be less likely in the future. The lessons learned from this tragedy continue to shape nuclear safety standards today, serving as a reminder of the importance of vigilance, regulation, and preparedness in handling radioactive materials. The Goiânia nuclear accident continues to be one of the most studied and referenced cases in the field of nuclear safety and disaster management. As one of the few instances of a radiological disaster involving civilian populations in a non-war setting, it has provided invaluable lessons for governments, nuclear agencies, and safety organizations around the world. The consequences of this tragedy underscore not only the dangers of mishandling radioactive materials, but also the complexities involved in managing such a disaster once it has occurred. These lessons have informed both the development of new safety protocols and disaster response strategies, providing a clear example of what can go wrong when safety measures fail and underscoring the need for comprehensive planning and public awareness. From a nuclear safety perspective, the Goiânia accident illustrated the devastating potential of an inadequate regulatory framework when it comes to handling dangerous materials. Before the disaster, Brazil had laws governing the use of radioactive substances, but they were insufficient in addressing the full range of risks posed by such materials. The lack of proper storage, disposal, and handling procedures for the cesium-137 device that led to the accident created a perfect storm of ignorance, negligence, and regulatory failure. This disaster made it evident that, while safety regulations might exist on paper, they need to be robustly enforced and regularly updated to account for emerging risks and technologies. The case of Goiânia stands as a critical reminder that failure in regulation can lead to large-scale harm not only to individuals directly involved but to entire communities, even entire cities. The aftermath of the Goiânia accident has also shaped the way disaster management strategies are developed for radiological and nuclear emergencies. In the days and weeks following the accident, Brazilian authorities, with support from international experts, found themselves scrambling to develop effective containment and decontamination measures. In some cases, they were forced to make decisions without the necessary expertise or preparedness, leading to mistakes that could have been avoided. While the response to the Goiânia incident eventually became more organized, it highlighted the importance of developing and maintaining specialized emergency plans for radiological incidents. A disaster management approach tailored to nuclear accidents must prioritize not only the immediate containment of radioactive materials, but also the long-term safety and health of affected populations. This includes everything from immediate evacuation and decontamination efforts to the psychological support of affected individuals. One of the most important lessons learned from the Goiânia accident was the significance of rapid public information dissemination. In the early stages of the crisis, many people, including emergency responders and medical personnel, were unaware of the risks posed by radiation. In particular, the widespread contamination was a direct result of a lack of public awareness about the nature of radioactive materials. The glowing cesium-137, mistaken for a valuable or interesting object, spread easily through the population, including children who played with it. This underscores the need for public education campaigns about radiation risks, particularly in communities where radioactive materials are used. The Goiânia incident made it clear that communities need to be well-versed in the dangers of radiation exposure and equipped with the knowledge necessary to respond appropriately in an emergency. Public awareness is crucial in preventing panic and helping people take the right actions during a disaster. In light of this, the importance of incorporating public education on radiation risks into everyday life became a key takeaway from the Goiânia case. In the wake of the incident, Brazil and other nations significantly increased their focus on educating the public about radioactive materials, how to recognize potential dangers, and what steps to take in the event of an exposure. Educational programs were developed to teach both children and adults about radiation safety, particularly in regions where radioactive materials were used in industries such as healthcare, mining, and research. Schools, hospitals, and public institutions began to include information on radiation safety in their curricula, with the aim of creating a more informed and prepared society. These efforts focused not only on responding to radiological incidents, but also on preventing the improper handling and disposal of radioactive materials in the first place. The Goiânia accident also demonstrated the challenges involved in managing long-term radiological contamination, as radiation exposure does not only result in immediate health effects, but can also lead to chronic conditions that require ongoing monitoring and care. The victims of the Goiânia disaster, many of whom were exposed to significant radiation doses, faced both short-term and long-term health consequences, including radiation sickness, burns, and an increased risk of cancer. Many of the people who came into contact with cesium-137 suffered from the physical effects of radiation for years after the accident. Some individuals, especially those who had prolonged exposure to the substance, were monitored for their health for decades after the event. This long-term health monitoring and the provision of continued medical care became a critical aspect of the response effort and have shaped the way radiological incidents are approached in terms of survivor care. In addition to public education, the Goiânia disaster highlighted the importance of building strong partnerships with international organizations in the event of a nuclear or radiological disaster. The scale of the accident and its far-reaching consequences quickly exceeded Brazil's capabilities, leading to the involvement of international experts who helped with containment, decontamination, and medical treatment. The International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, and the World Health Organization, WHO, among other organizations, played key roles in providing technical support and guidance on how to address the crisis. This international collaboration not only helped Brazil deal with the immediate disaster, but also contributed to the development of more comprehensive global safety standards for nuclear materials. The case demonstrated that nuclear safety is not just a national issue but a global one, requiring cross-border cooperation and the sharing of expertise in times of crisis. Finally, the Goiânia accident remains a vital case study for nuclear regulators and safety professionals worldwide. It provides a powerful example of the consequences of inadequate safety procedures, insufficient regulation, and lack of public awareness, as well as the importance of having a well-coordinated and well-equipped response plan. The tragedy of Goiânia helped to inform the policies and practices that govern the safe use, handling, and disposal of radioactive materials, serving as a stark reminder of the potential dangers posed by radiation when not managed properly. It continues to be a reference point for ongoing discussions in the fields of nuclear safety, public health, and emergency management, reinforcing the need for vigilance, preparation, and education in preventing and responding to radiological disasters. In conclusion, the Goiânia nuclear accident remains a critical case study in nuclear safety, disaster management, and public education about radiation risks. The lessons learned from this disaster have had a profound impact on nuclear regulations, safety procedures, and international collaboration, ensuring that the world is better prepared to deal with similar incidents in the future. The ongoing study of Goiânia serves as a constant reminder of the devastating potential of mishandling radioactive materials and the importance of educating both the public and professionals to minimize the risks associated with radiation exposure. The Goiânia nuclear accident was not only a physical disaster, but also a profound social, economic, and psychological crisis that left deep scars on the survivors, their families, and the broader community. While the immediate health and environmental effects were catastrophic, the longer-term consequences of the accident were felt on an emotional and economic level as well. The fallout from the disaster extended far beyond the contaminated areas, with entire families being uprooted from their homes, businesses suffering due to loss of trade, and individuals struggling with the psychological trauma of being exposed to dangerous radiation. For many of the survivors, the accident marked the beginning of a prolonged period of uncertainty and fear. Several individuals, especially those who were exposed to high levels of radiation, faced ongoing health problems such as radiation sickness, burns, and long-term risks like cancer. In the immediate aftermath, many survivors experienced physical symptoms such as vomiting, fatigue, and skin burns from the radiation exposure. However, the most lasting impact came in the form of chronic illnesses. Some survivors have had to deal with the lingering effects of radiation exposure for decades, with increased cancer diagnoses, particularly cancers of the thyroid and bone marrow. The survivors often faced numerous medical challenges, undergoing multiple treatments, hospital visits, and even surgeries to manage the health issues arising from the radiation exposure. Aside from the physical toll, the psychological impact of the disaster was equally severe. Survivors had to contend with the trauma of their exposure to a life-threatening situation, with some experiencing symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. The uncertainty about their future health, especially knowing that they had been exposed to something as dangerous as cesium-137, created long-lasting anxiety and fear. Many survivors reported living in a state of constant worry about the potential development of cancer or other radiation-induced diseases. The mental anguish that came with this fear was compounded by the difficulty of accessing sufficient psychological care, as the healthcare system was overwhelmed in the wake of the disaster. The trauma was not limited to those directly exposed to radiation. Many of the families of the victims were also deeply affected. In some cases, individuals who were not physically contaminated by radiation still suffered from the psychological effects of the disaster, especially as they witnessed their loved ones suffer. Parents, in particular, found it difficult to cope with the trauma of seeing their children exposed to radiation or witnessing them develop radiation sickness. This emotional toll extended to entire communities as people grappled with the effects of living in an area where contamination was widespread. The widespread fear of radiation exposure left many residents feeling helpless, isolated, and paranoid, unsure of what steps to take to protect themselves or their families. For those living in contaminated areas, the impact was especially acute. Whole neighborhoods were forced to evacuate, leaving families homeless and dislocated. Those who lived near the epicenter of the contamination saw their homes and belongings rendered unsafe due to radiation exposure. In some cases, entire buildings were demolished or sealed off to prevent further contamination, leaving families with no choice but to start over in new locations. This dislocation was not only a physical displacement, but also a loss of community. For many, their homes represented their connection to their community, and having to leave was a deeply painful experience. The economic impact of the Goiânia disaster was also significant, affecting both individuals and the city as a whole. Businesses located in contaminated areas were forced to close or relocate, which led to a loss of income and employment for many people. The city's economy, which had been relatively stable before the accident, took a severe hit as the contaminated zones became uninhabitable. People living in those areas faced additional challenges in rebuilding their lives, including finding new employment and sources of income. The cost of cleaning up the contamination and providing long-term care for the affected population was also enormous, placing an additional burden on both local and national resources. The government had to allocate significant funding to clean up the radioactive materials, decontaminate buildings, and assist those affected, all while trying to manage the broader economic ramifications of the disaster. The long-term economic repercussions of the accident extended beyond just the immediate area of contamination. The fear of radiation exposure created an atmosphere of suspicion, which led to a decline in tourism and a general decrease in business activities throughout the city. People from outside Goiânia became hesitant to visit the city, fearing they might be exposed to radiation or that the area might be permanently contaminated. This decrease in tourism and business activity further affected the local economy, contributing to a sense of stagnation and economic hardship in the region. The public perception of the city was severely damaged, and it took years for Goiânia to recover from the blow to its reputation. Furthermore, the Goiânia accident highlighted the need for a more robust approach to community support in the aftermath of a nuclear disaster. The psychological and social damage caused by such an event goes beyond the immediate effects of radiation. It affects the sense of security, trust in local authorities, and overall well-being of individuals. In this case, the survivors and the broader community struggled not only with the physical aftermath, but also with a loss of trust in the government and the nuclear regulatory authorities. Many felt that their safety had been compromised due to a lack of oversight and preparedness, and they were left questioning the competence of those in charge of nuclear safety and public health. This breakdown of trust was further exacerbated by the delayed and sometimes inadequate communication from the authorities, which added to the anxiety and confusion experienced by the affected population. The government's failure to provide sufficient emotional and psychological support in the wake of the accident meant that many victims were left to cope with the disaster on their own, often without access to the counseling and mental health services they desperately needed. In the years following the disaster, there were calls for more comprehensive mental health programs to assist those affected by the Goiânia tragedy. Some advocacy groups and survivors began to push for better social services, including counseling for trauma victims and financial support for displaced families. These calls emphasized the importance of addressing the broader, long-term social and psychological consequences of radiological accidents. As the years passed, survivors and affected communities began to rebuild their lives, but the social, economic, and psychological scars of the disaster remained. While some individuals were able to move forward with their lives, the trauma of the accident has left a permanent mark on the community. The impact on children, who are often the most vulnerable to radiation exposure, has been especially significant, with some individuals still grappling with the long-term effects of their exposure, both physically and emotionally. The Goiânia accident, as a whole, became a painful reminder of the far-reaching consequences of a nuclear disaster and the importance of addressing the full range of effects, from physical health risks to social and psychological recovery. In sum, the social, economic, and psychological impacts of the Goiânia nuclear accident were profound and long-lasting. The survivors and their families faced not only the immediate effects of radiation exposure, but also the ongoing challenges of dealing with health problems, economic dislocation, and psychological trauma. The broader community experienced a loss of trust in authorities, economic hardship, and social dislocation. The accident underscored the need for comprehensive disaster management strategies that address not just the physical aftermath of a nuclear incident, but also the broader social and psychological consequences for those affected. The Goiânia nuclear accident, though now several decades in the past, remains a stark reminder of the critical need for vigilance, regulation, and responsible management of nuclear technology. It exposed glaring weaknesses in how radioactive materials were regulated, handled, and disposed of, particularly in the absence of effective oversight and safeguards. The tragedy highlighted that, despite the advancements made in the field of nuclear technology, the risks associated with nuclear materials remain significant and require continuous, rigorous attention. It served as a wake-up call to both the authorities and the public that nuclear safety is not a one-time responsibility, but a constant commitment that demands ongoing vigilance, training, and a proactive approach to addressing potential risks. At the heart of the Goiânia accident was the failure of regulatory frameworks. Before the disaster, Brazil's nuclear regulations were either insufficient or poorly enforced, leaving critical gaps in the safe handling, transportation, and disposal of radioactive materials. The cesium-137 source, which caused the disaster, had been mishandled for years and was left abandoned in an unsecured location. This oversight was the result of lax regulations that allowed dangerous materials to be stored without adequate safeguards, ultimately leading to contamination of an entire community. The incident underscored the need for more robust and comprehensive regulatory systems for nuclear safety. It became evident that countries must not only create regulations, but also enforce them effectively to ensure that radioactive materials are handled with the utmost care and safety, particularly in sectors such as healthcare, industry, and research. The incident also illuminated the need for continuous monitoring and control over radioactive substances, particularly those that have long-lasting effects. Cesium-137, the substance involved in the Goiânia accident, has a half-life of 30 years, meaning that once released, it can remain hazardous for generations. This long-term risk requires that regulatory authorities consistently monitor and track the use, storage, and disposal of radioactive materials to prevent them from being lost, stolen, or mishandled. Additionally, radioactive materials that have reached the end of their useful life must be disposed of properly to ensure that they do not become a hazard. The disaster in Goiânia demonstrated that regulatory systems must evolve with the growing use of nuclear technology, incorporating new measures to safeguard against emerging threats and vulnerabilities. Whether it is the storage of old radioactive equipment or the transportation of hazardous waste, nuclear materials require constant oversight to ensure public safety. One of the critical aspects of nuclear safety that the Goiânia accident exposed was the need for adequate training and preparedness for emergency response personnel. The response to the disaster was hampered by a lack of training in handling radiological emergencies, and this contributed to the spread of contamination. Many first responders, including firefighters and medical staff, were initially unaware of the risks posed by radiation and were not equipped with the knowledge or tools to deal with the situation. In fact, some of them came into contact with the radioactive material without taking the necessary precautions, exacerbating the spread of contamination. The tragedy highlighted the importance of specialized training for emergency responders who may encounter radioactive materials in their line of work. In the wake of the incident, authorities in Brazil and internationally recognized the need to develop more rigorous training programs for emergency personnel, ensuring that they would be well-equipped to handle nuclear and radiological accidents in the future. The Goiânia accident also demonstrated the necessity of clear communication and public education about radiation risks. One of the major issues in the aftermath of the incident was the confusion surrounding the dangers of radioactive contamination. In the early days of the disaster, there was a lack of public awareness about radiation, and many people unknowingly came into contact with the cesium-137. Some individuals even saw the radioactive material as a curiosity, playing with it or bringing it into their homes. This highlights the need for ongoing public education campaigns that emphasize the dangers of radiation and the appropriate actions to take in the event of an incident. It is critical that people understand the nature of radiation, how to identify possible sources of contamination, and what to do if they suspect they've been exposed. Effective communication, both before and after a nuclear incident, can help prevent confusion, reduce panic, and guide people through the necessary steps to stay safe. Furthermore, the Goiânia disaster revealed the importance of international collaboration and information sharing when it comes to nuclear safety. While Brazil's response to the incident was primarily national, it was quickly realized that the disaster had global implications due to the widespread impact of nuclear materials. International organizations like the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, and the World Health Organization, WHO, stepped in to assist with containment efforts and provide expertise in managing the radiological fallout. This cooperative approach showed the importance of having global frameworks for nuclear safety that encourage the exchange of knowledge, resources, and best practices. Nuclear safety cannot be addressed effectively by any one country alone, as the materials involved are mobile and can pose risks beyond borders. Global collaboration is essential for addressing nuclear risks, preventing accidents, and coordinating responses to international emergencies. As nuclear technology continues to advance and more countries adopt nuclear energy or utilize radioactive materials in various sectors, the Goiânia accident serves as a critical reminder that nuclear safety must always be at the forefront of national and international priorities. With the increasing complexity of nuclear technologies and the potential risks involved, regulatory bodies, governments, and industry stakeholders must remain vigilant, adapting regulations to new challenges and technologies. This means that nuclear safety protocols must be regularly updated to incorporate the latest scientific knowledge, technological innovations, and lessons learned from past incidents like Goiânia. Regulatory bodies should prioritize safety, invest in research and development for new safety technologies, and create a culture of safety where nuclear hazards are taken seriously at every level, from the individual worker to the highest government officials. In addition to regulatory reforms, the Goiânia incident reinforced the need for stronger accountability and oversight in the nuclear industry. Those responsible for the mishandling of the radioactive material in Goiânia were held accountable, but the broader system of accountability was often weak, and there was little oversight of how radioactive materials were being managed at the time. The lack of accountability contributed to the negligence that led to the accident. Stronger mechanisms for accountability, both within regulatory bodies and the private sector, are essential to ensure that safety standards are adhered to and that violations are promptly addressed. This accountability should extend to all aspects of nuclear safety, including waste management, transportation, and disposal, to ensure that radioactive materials do not pose a risk to public health and safety. Finally, the Goiânia disaster highlights the need for a broad and inclusive approach to nuclear safety. It is not enough to focus solely on the technical aspects of nuclear power or radiological materials. The accident showed that public engagement and community involvement are essential elements of a comprehensive nuclear safety strategy. Governments and regulatory bodies must engage with communities to ensure that citizens are informed about the risks associated with nuclear technology and are aware of the necessary precautions to take in the event of an emergency. This includes not only providing technical information but also addressing the social, economic, and psychological impacts that nuclear accidents can have on communities. By fostering a collaborative approach to nuclear safety that includes industry professionals, emergency responders, government agencies, and the general public, countries can build more resilient systems for preventing and responding to nuclear incidents. In conclusion, the Goiânia nuclear accident serves as an essential reminder of the need for ongoing vigilance, responsible regulation, and the accountable use of nuclear technology to ensure public safety. The lessons learned from this disaster have shaped global standards for nuclear safety, emphasizing the need for continuous monitoring, improved training, effective communication, and international cooperation. The ongoing commitment to these principles is essential to prevent future tragedies and to create a safer world for everyone in the age of nuclear technology. In conclusion, the Goiânia nuclear accident remains a tragic yet invaluable lesson in the importance of stringent nuclear safety regulations, effective emergency responses, and public awareness. The far-reaching consequences of this disaster highlighted the need for constant vigilance in managing radioactive materials and for robust systems of accountability at every level. By learning from past mistakes and integrating these lessons into global safety standards, we can ensure a safer future in the handling and use of nuclear technology. It is only through continued education, collaboration, and a commitment to responsible practices that we can prevent such a catastrophe from happening again, protecting not just individuals, but entire communities and nations from the devastating effects of radiological hazards.